Hi class, Nikki Maxon. I chose to do the biography this week on Walt Disney, the one and only. This is from the Who Was, Who Is series. This particular book was written by Whitney Stewart, illustrated by Nancy Harrison. Um, if you guys are frequenters of the library, they usually have a huge little section with just this particular Who Was series. There's actually a list in the very back. I don't know if you can see it, very nice glare, of all the people that they've written about. I mean, everyone from Bill Gates to Theodore Roosevelt. This book, I would say, is probably geared towards maybe maybe third grader could read it if they're a pretty good reader, but probably like fourth grade and up. Um, I found it read very well. For instance, they have them broken down in very short chapters, which is easy to follow, easy to read. They first talk about who the person is, and then they start in with the first chapter. One thing I particularly liked about this this series of books is, for instance, whenever there was an event or a person or a place, something that they've talked about that their reader may not already know, they have a little excerpt about it. Like, for instance, they mentioned Charlie Chaplin. Obviously, a child reading today may have no idea who Charlie Chaplin was. So it had just like a little teeny blurb about who he was, what he did. Same thing with the Great Depression. When it mentions the Great Depression, it talks a little bit about what that was. It also gives them like a little animation basics, because obviously they talk about animation, which is kind of a big word for maybe younger readers. Just like something that we probably wouldn't think of. So here's a little thing on the Great Depression. And it basically goes through his whole life, about where he came from, where he started, and basically where he ended up, and how he's still impacting our world today. So the very last chapter, the final act is what they call it, because Walt died before he was able to see his dream of Epcot come to fruition. He was alive when they purchased the land, but unfortunately he died before it was obviously finished. So they actually talk about Epcot because, again, some of the readers may have never been, and it talks about how it was, or how it stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. But when Walt had designed it, he actually wanted people to live and work in this community. He felt that, let's see if it says, it says there would be no crime, slums, or traffic. However, after his death, the Disney company decided that it did not want to run an entire city. So they actually changed the vision of it to showcase different cultures and customs around the world, which is, if anyone's been, that's exactly what it is today. So I thought it was a very easy, quick read, obviously for somebody older. It was chock full of information that I found completely fascinating. I mean, obviously someone as popular as Walt Disney, you think you might already know the person. But for instance, like when it talked about who he was, it talked about how he enjoyed being a class clown, and how he had caught, so right here, the very first, like, here's Walt Disney, it talks about how he caught a field mouse and made a leash out of string for it, and he waltzed into class and paraded around his new pet. Obviously, much to the teacher's dismay. She was totally terrified. But it kind of prefaces it like, little did he know that someday him and another mouse would be famous around the entire world. So I thought it was just really neat, like little tidbits of information that probably never would have stumbled across otherwise. I thought it did a great job of, again, explaining events or people or things that might not be already known by the reader. I didn't feel that there was any inaccurate information. However, they do list in the very back a bibliography of all their sources. So obviously, if you really wanted to go and fact check everything, you totally could. There was also a list in the back of his most famous movies. starting with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, and then all the way down to Mary Poppins in 64, which happens to be my personal favorite. Something I also enjoyed about this series, I don't know if you can kind of say, I know the glare is so terrible, but here it kind of gives a timeline of events in his life versus events happening in the world at the same time or similar times. Like, for instance, when he marries his wife, that was in 1925, but also in 1925 it talks about how that's when Adolf Hitler published his Mein Kampf. So it's kind of like they don't always match up, like where you're like, that's really random. But then sometimes there's things where, for instance, when Dr. Seuss published his first children's book in 1937, it actually coincided with the release in 1937 of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So like those kind of make sense. So it's just really interesting to see where his life kind of fell in like world events. For instance, one thing I did not know about him was that he drove an ambulance in France during the First World War, which was in 1918. However, if you look back over on the timeline of the world, that's actually also the year that World War I ended. So that would tell me that he did drive the ambulance, but obviously he wasn't there for an extended period of time. So if you're looking for a biography for you or your children or classroom, I highly recommend this series. I highly recommend Walt Disney because very fascinating man. Yeah, and I can't imagine any kid that wouldn't enjoy reading more about Disney. So yeah, so that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.